On the phone, it's a pleasure to welcome to the program Barbara Garson. She is the author of Down the Up Escalator, How the 99% Live in the Great Recession. Welcome to the program, Barbara.
Thank you.
So, Barbara, give me a sense. I mean, I think this our audience is pretty familiar with the structural reasons that we see such stagnation and whatnot across the country in terms of wages, and in terms of who was hit in the wake of this financial crisis. One of the things about your story is that you really dig into the stories of individuals, and you organize these folks in terms of their loss of job, home, and savings. What did you find? I mean, was there a common theme that you?
Yes, there was. I mean, I kind of, like you said, there was a structural problem. Everybody has written a lot about the the banks and the particular scheme of securitizing housing loans at the end. But in fact, what I found is that everybody involved, in order to live just an ordinary life that they thought was a middle-class life, had been borrowing. Some of them were house loans, and people lost their houses, mortgage loans, but others were college loans that they were encouraged to take. And so as I began to talk to people, I realized that they or their parents had been economically stagnating or actually losing wages and losing wealth for about 40 years. And the banks, as they didn't get paid enough money to buy what they produced, so to speak, banks lent them the money. It's as if they said to them, oh, instead of paying you to buy what you produce, we'll lend you the money. Obviously, that's a short-range strategy. I mean, if a man doesn't have $10 this year, how is he going to have $15 next year to pay you back with interest if his wages aren't going up or if his salary isn't going up? And that short-range thing was kind of desperation on the bank's part. I mean, wages weren't going up. Productivity was increasing greatly. So it were ordinary people that I met who did what they should have done, who they were encouraged to do. Buy a starter house, and then you're going to sell that for more and move to another house, take out loans for college. They were stuck. And it really all came not so much from their desperate need to borrow, but from the bank's desperate need to lend, because companies weren't borrowing in normal ways to produce more, because, it was that vicious circle that started with the great idea that came up starting in the 1970s and reached its peak in the Reagan administration. Will just squeeze the profits out of ordinary people.
Now, give me a sense. I mean, I want to circle back to that and sort of the level of awareness that people had in terms of seeing their predicaments in a broader context. But before we get there, give me a sense of the types of people that you interviewed. I mean, you set out, I think it was in 2009, right? And so you were really on the road for quite a while.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand. On the road to?
On the road in terms of talking to many people who...
Oh, yes. I did talk to a lot of people around the country. When you lose your house, you might think that the broker gave you a bum steer. But in the absence of a political movement, it's not likely that you're going to think what I just said about your being the victim of 40 years of an economic downturn. You just think you're angry at a particular broker if that's your inclination. Or worse of all, many people are just upset about themselves. I was a sucker. I was a loser. A man who's worked about 35 years for the same big box company in Evansville, Indiana, is saying, some people, they sell a house, they make money. but not us. So he was in a position where he couldn't sell his house to move to a farm where he intended to retire. In the meantime, his company is kind of forcing him out of work. He's worked for them for 40 years. His favorite thing, 35 years. His favorite thing is refereeing soccer, which he does now, even though his children are too old to play themselves. And suddenly the company is giving him night shifts, 12-hour shifts, 10-hour shifts. Of course, he's a manager, so he has no extra time. And he believes, remembering back to the 50s and television programs primarily, that a manager should be able to take his family on vacation, put the kids through college, buy a car every few years, and he can't do any of that. And I think that in his own mind, yes, he believes certain individuals have been unfair to him, but basically he feels like he just couldn't cut the mustard. It's a very unfortunate feeling, and in the absence of a program like yours or some kind of movement that maybe explained to him what happened, he will go on feeling that way. It's a funny feeling, funny family, because this was part of a family where he just wanted his son to do better. And the kid was sort of a hippie, because the kid looked at the father's situation and said, I'm not going to work like that for anybody.
Right.
And the father would say, if only he would cut his hair, he could buckle down and get a good job. And he was very smart. He kept saying, oh, he's so smart, which he was. And so, but I'd ask him what his friends could do. And the only jobs he could think of in Evansville for his friends, he'd say, well, if they put on the hairnet at McDonald's, they're smart. They'll work their way up to manager. My company hires McDonald's managers sometimes because they have a lot of discipline, and they could then soon have the position he has, the position in which he knows they're trying to force him out, take away his pension. I mean, it's very sad, but certainly he thinks of himself as to blame.
That's fascinating. And I mean, are there other? Do you have other examples of the people that you spoke to that have a sort of a similar perspective in terms of blaming? Seeing the problems. In many respects, it's seeing their economic problems as isolated and as unique in some respect.
Well, everybody does. Well, no, I take it back. A lot of people had the comfort of at least saying this is a recession when they at first couldn't find jobs. Like I interviewed 4 people living here in New York who discovered through their church that they were all unemployed. So they formed a Pinkslipped Club. And they thought that for the 2 or 3 weeks that they were out of work, why not enjoy the city? That's what they paid those high rents to do. And they would go to concerts during the day and tell each other about free movie screenings they could get into. And then the weeks turned into months. Now, in some regard, they had the comfort of knowing it was a recession. All of them remembered the jobs they got 20 years earlier that they got, just by asking around a little bit. And they thought that would happen again. And they knew it was a recession, but still, that does not save you from the pain they were feeling as they sent in applications. These are all professionals, sort of middle-range professionals, an insurance adjuster, a person who did graphics, meaning not the pictures, but the layout for textbooks. These people were sort of professionals, and yes, they knew it was a recession, but believe me, they felt pretty awful sending in hundreds and eventually thousands of resumes, always online, always to people that didn't respond, even the courtesy of saying the position has already been filled. They felt pretty bad. I mean, even though they had the comfort of knowing this is a recession, this isn't us, I wasn't fired for cause, nobody said you are fired, but rather we are cutting back. Another thing that shows you how the country is changing is that not only won't these individuals, if they get a job, the job itself will have changed. In other words, while these people were unemployed, the jobs they previously had were converted by the companies for the most part, and I have a lot of good examples where I follow the company and I follow the person, were converted into part-time, contingent. You become a consultant, an entrepreneur. And so that graphics person, if he gets another job, will never get the same salary and will never really get the same job, and neither will anybody else. So that's why it's not really a temporary recession. It's a big downhill thing that it's funny. It's the ruling class in this country that seems to think the country is finished and this is the way we have to go, and there's no moving back up, and they'll just sell to people abroad. So it's really a very sad picture, although some of the people were very clever and
well, what is the emotional arc of those people? I mean, I get the idea that the sense sometimes of isolation, and I also get the notion of that isolation being mitigated by this sense that the nation is in a recession. But what happens after they realize that they're not going to get another job, that this recession is not resolving itself in the same way that maybe past recessions have? What are...
Well, I got to know one of the people very well, the insurance adjuster. She was such an efficient person. When I said, oh, she told me about the day she was fired. Everybody tells you about the day they were fired, and they have usually some way of telling the story in which they personally show a little dignity, like they finished their work or they helped a colleague. This person said, I was like jelly. I couldn't move. I don't know how I walked through the day. And then she told me about a friend who invited her out to dinner, said that she always did that. Someone did it for her once, and she always did it for people who were fired. So I said, I'd like to talk to your friend. Now, this was about 2 weeks after after she was fired, and she immediately made a phone call, set us up very, very, very efficiently while we were talking, like encouraging me to make the date and get it straight, and I did, and she was that kind of person. Well, by a year and a half later, she was a much more lethargic person. You wouldn't think to hire her for the same job, because remember, insurance adjusting involved calling people, taking a lot of initiative, calling people up on the telephone, finding the real story, getting them to settle. She was, in that regard, a different person. I mean, she'd taken in a roommate. She'd done one thing after another. She'd gone through her 401k or whatever her non-retirement plan was. And that's another example. When she first started working, she had a real retirement system, but that was dissolved by the company and changed into these new things. So, yeah, of course it's a downhill move. I found one terrific guy who I never thought would find a job, who found the almost identical job, and it was just amazing when he did. It was amazing transformation. I mean, it's like a miracle. You don't believe, when you see a person that's that down, it's hard for you to imagine that they'll spring back and be the other person, or that they ever were the other person. I mean, look, my husband had it wasn't a recession thing. Rupert Murdoch fired all the people at the New York Post, and he was a photographer. And you wouldn't think that you'd feel bad about being fired by Rupert Murdoch. You wouldn't want to be the person he kept. But still, and he wasn't going to starve to death. I mean, there was always me, writer. And yet, he was in the hospital 2 times thinking he was having a heart attack. His heart was beating so fast. You can't talk yourself out of that personal response, even though you know everybody's in the situation, unless there's something that's absent right now, a real movement that says, hey, let's do something. Let's raise wages. Let's have a student debt strike. Unless you have that, I don't think you can feel.
I'm curious, did you come across people who, as they became more...
And even if you have that, you might not feel...
Right.
You might still suspect you're the one.
Well, yeah, I'm curious. I mean, did you come across any examples of people who, as they became, as their job search wore on, as they became more discouraged, were there any that whose perspective shifted from blaming themselves or seeing themselves as uniquely unfortunate? Were there any that in some way became radicalized or began to perceive themselves within the context, or as a victim of something far greater than themselves, far greater than their own personal decisions, but rather something structural?
Well, I did meet one person down at Liberty Square, Occupy.
Right.
And that was the beginning of that. Was someone who was overwhelmed by his student debts. Again, something he was encouraged to take, and he began to realize, hey, an 8.5% debt when the government is giving away money for free, and that debt is one that the bank can't possibly lose on because the government will cover it if I stop paying. So he began to get involved in the debt movement, and I think that made him feel a little less like a personal sucker who took out a debt that he would repay through a job that didn't exist. I mean, some of the people I met, I talked to extreme people. I mean, extreme in their suffering. I had dinner with someone who didn't know where she was going to live the next day because I'd met her in court. And and she said, "Gee, I think the sheriff holds your stuff for 10 days, doesn't he? She has 4 floors of furniture." So of course she was extremely down and out, and that was an extreme case. But I also met people who were very normal, who did what they were supposed to do. And there was one little chapter I called Bubble Birth Control, because this perfectly model young man and his wife who had borrowed money to go to school, hadn't lost their jobs, they were private high school teachers, but they wanted to move to a place where they were both able to get very secure jobs in the same city of Minneapolis. And when they went, and they had one child, and when they went to sell their house, they discovered that if they sold it at the current prices, they would still owe the bank $200,000.
It's a classic case of being underwater.
Do I move under those circumstances? And they did. And they were if the lawyer they left behind couldn't arrange a short sale, which is very difficult to arrange, they would be they would ruin their credit rating. But they did move, and I left them in suspense. But these people did every normal thing that they were supposed to do. So I think, understood that the circumstances went against them.
I'm curious about their example, because you write about...
They're so normal. I mean, a woman wrote me... Oh, yes, go ahead.
Well, I mean, because the idea about it, I mean, this is one of the things that I think sort of the Occupy movement was built upon, and for some reason at one point hit a stasis. Now, part of that is because you had a massive police force that was shutting them down in many respects.
Part of it, let's face it, part of it is because however much fun it is to have an elitist movement, we did the same thing in Berkeley. Doesn't leave a lot behind, but okay.
But I mean, but this impetus where you have this couple that basically say, we're going to walk, we're going to mail in the keys to this house, we're going to walk away from this, that they become untethered from this notion that somehow their debt is a moral debt, whereas if I'm a company and I default on, with my creditors, I go into Chapter 11, I reorganize, that's business. That's not, there's no morality involved in that. I've never seen,
that happen. If you want to talk of that as a radicalization, I did certainly watched that happen. People who well, to tell you the truth, the only people left feeling it was a debt that I'd interviewed were church ladies, black church ladies, who still had to go bankrupt, but who felt terrible about that debt. I was so surprised at the people who walked away from those debts. I met a man who paid for a year and a half while he tried to negotiate a modification under these crazy Obama rules.
Under HAMP, under the Home Affordable Modification Plan.
Right, which was it was a completely voluntary program. The only thing the banks were required to do was to accept your application.
And we should say there has been extraordinary evidence just this past month from about a half dozen whistleblowers from the Bank of America, and there's no reason to believe that other banks were involved in this, that the banks were actually giving bonuses to their employees for not telling people what modification they're available for and driving them into foreclosure. I mean, this was a systemic plan by the banks after the fact, and this has just came out, I think, in the past month or so, that at the very least, Bank of America.
God. I talked to people. A man took this huge pile of negotiations. He was very good at this. This was his former job. He was a bureaucrat. And he had this huge stack of papers he put down in front of me with the bank requesting the same information over and over. All this time, him paying his mortgage, even though he's unemployed. He's borrowing from his mother-in-law, etc. He just felt that that was an obligation. And he said to me, do you think they are just confused, asking for the same information over and over again, or you think they're just stalling? And it was very hard to tell. And this man went through about a year and a half, and when he finally found a new job and they refused his modification, that's when he stopped paying on his house. I was so amazed because he was such a moral man. And he just, the last time I spoke to him, he was in the house and he called the bank and he said, well, come and get it if you want it. And I was so amazed by that personal transformation in him. It still leaves him very insecure, but it leaves him mentally in a position where he can decide when to move, and I think he will, and he'll run away from the house.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that dynamic is fascinating to me, and of course, like I say, I have listeners of this program who went through a very similar thing. That the HAMP program was, in many respects, for them, simply a completely fraudulent, and now we have, evidence that in fact it was. Fraudulent, in its.
Well, I'm going to have to get that for you after the on the air because within down the up escalator, he and I sit there. He keeps asking me over and over, could this be real? Do you think they just don't understand? They constantly change negotiators with him, and each negotiator. And they would have programs called the HOPE program. He said, I think it has something to do with Obama. I'm promoted to the HOPE program, which only means that they lost all my papers again. And they were just stalling, he felt, as long as he would go on paying. HOPE meant they would give him some false hope as long as he could go on paying. So I will be happy to show that to him.
Oh, yes. David Dayen has reported on this in Salon. I think it was probably maybe 10, 15 days ago, so middle of June.
I shall go look at it. David who?
David Dayen.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have a bad connection. So
well, I will. I'll give you that after the interview. But I mean, okay. So I mean, it's so. I mean, ultimately, what to the extent that when you step back and you take a look at what you reported on, what you saw, what is the broader sense that you get? I mean, in other words, can you get a sense of a broader change in the way that the people at the very least that you spoke to viewed their place in society in a sort of in a political way, as opposed to, I mean, this is what sort of fascinates me, is that what are the circumstances that allow for someone to see this as their individual plight? What are those things that radicalize in the sense that I'm not going to perceive my debt in the way that the banks want me to perceive that debt?
People get people may become cynical, but in the absence of a movement, in the absence, a few people who are talking about socialism say, hey, people are ready to listen. But without talking about it, I don't think people automatically get the idea that
I mean, I wonder what is missing here from this equation? Because it's almost as if there's,
Well, in the 30s there was a large communist and socialist movement, actually, and they didn't win the day, so to speak, for their movements, but they they certainly scared the capitalists into taking some stand. I can't believe that they're just going on now saying, ho-hum, as long as we put the next bank crisis off for a while, we're okay. You need to do what you're doing to get enough consciousness out there that we can say to somebody, let's nationalize the banks. Let's make our banks used for our purposes. I mean, it's people will only begin to think about that sort of thing. You don't think about it spontaneously, I don't think. You only feel maybe more cynical spontaneously. Spontaneously, people began to not pay their debts. Whether that's good or bad, I'm not sure, but that happened spontaneously.
And I
don't think they formed debtors' movements that said forgive these debts spontaneously.
But
that would be a great thing. When student loans first started, these high-interest student loans, I really thought in my mind, I'm talking 30 years ago, I said, that's going to be the next great bonus march. People are going to be marching for forgiveness of student debts, because if there aren't jobs, student debts are a pyramid scheme.
It's fascinating,
but
because
it didn't happen. I'm amazed that it hasn't happened yet. I think it's the most productive of the items that have remained from Occupy are their debt committees, but I don't know whether they is being we. I don't know whether me, will be able to put the work in to make it really a full-fledged movement.
Well,
that's when you'll feel not so bad about having a stupid student debt.
Well, Barbara Garson, Hope Springs Eternal. The book is Down the Up Escalator: How the 99% Live in the Great Recession. I appreciate your time today.